Okay, so in my last video, I just want to talk briefly about what to make of this finding, how to think about these results. So the first thing we might want to think about is whether this is really a important insight about the world, or whether this is just an insight about Oxford and Cambridge. In other words, could it be that overall social mobility might have increased dramatically in England over this time period, and might change a lot across different societies, based on the amount of social spending, all this sort of stuff, but that elite institutions are just their own animal and they really don't change very much. And the way that Clark and Cummins are going to argue against this is they're going to look at a slightly less dramatic or slightly less super elite measure of elite status, which is whether you're wealthy enough when you die to get probate records made. And so they're going to say, using the same method, right, are these family names that they identify as elite based on attendance at Oxford and Cambridge going to be overrepresented among families who are wealthy enough to have probate records? And is the rate of change in their representation among probate records going to imply a higher or lower transmission of status across generations than what you'd get from looking at Oxford and Cambridge attendance? And what they're going to find is they're going to estimate a very, very similar rate of transmission of status from parent to child looking at these probate records as they estimated looking at attendance at Oxford and Cambridge. Instead of getting an estimate of 0.73, they're getting an estimate of about 0.78. And again, they're not going to find much evidence at all that there are changes in this level of intergenerational transmission across the time period for which they have these records. Now, they don't present it in this paper. They've got a whole book on this, which is pretty interesting and really weird, and I don't know what to think of it. But they've got a whole book on this where they do similar methods to estimate the rate of intergenerational transmission of status using a bunch of different indicators of status like wealth, education, membership in elite societies in Sweden, in the United States, in India, China, Japan. And they're going to find that in all of these societies, they're going to see very, very low rates of social mobility, very high estimated betas. And they're not going to see much evidence that those rates of social mobility converge over time. So if we buy this strategy, it's really difficult to argue that this is just a matter of Oxford and Cambridge. It looks like this is going to be, or that it's just a matter of England being, unbelievably class-based society. If we believe their strategy, we're going to have to conclude that this is a general finding that applies to a large number of contexts. Okay, so the first thing we might want to think about is, do we want to believe this big result? Is this a method that we should trust? And I should say, I'm skeptical of this research for a variety of reasons that I don't want to get into too much here because it's already been long enough and technical enough. But in general, I think you should be skeptical when researchers have lots of opportunities to change the way that they define their variables, to manipulate their data sets, to make decisions about just how elite Oxford and Cambridge should be, or how big the variance and status should be, or all these sorts of things that could potentially affect their results. So I think there's some room to be skeptical of this approach, just because it gives researchers so much margin for error. At the same time, the fact that they find such persistence in status over very, very long time frames and across many different societies should make us think that they're probably right to believe that intergenerational transmission of status is more persistent, that there's less mobility than we would guess from other methods. That, for example, Korak or Chetty are underestimating the degree to which your ancestors affect your likely options in life and your children's options in life. At the same time, a specific reason that we should maybe be a little bit careful with this research is we might want to think about the ways that groups of families that share a name might have changes in status over time that are different from groups of families that share status for other reasons. In particular, we might worry if we think that these measures of status groupings, right, these family names, are capturing something about the particular subculture or group identity that you belong to in England. So, for example, if we look at the people in the Domesday Book, we're looking at people who are aristocrats, right, who are British aristocrats. And based on the models we've talked about, both our identity and social distance models or discrimination models, we might think that identifiable elite groups or identifiable underclasses could have lower rates of intergenerational mobility than do less identifiable groups of elite or less elite people. So it could be that the intergenerational transmission of status among people with these very unusual, very high status names is in fact slower than among equally high status people who have names like Smith or Johnson. The last thing I want you guys to think about before I let you go for this lecture is just how broadly we should interpret this result as suggesting that social institutions don't matter. So if we take this seriously and we think that the end of feudalism didn't change the transmission of status from generation to generation, and universal suffrage didn't change the transmission of status from generation to generation, and public education didn't change it, and the end of Latin-based admissions exams didn't change it, it should make us really skeptical that big policy ideas that we have now are likely to have an impact, right? If those things didn't matter, why would we think that something like a universal basic income would matter, or universal health care would matter, or free public college would matter? But another way to think about this is to think that even if the transmission of what Clark and Cummins are calling status is incredibly persistent over time, institutions might matter in how they determine the role that status plays in the life that you get to live. In other words, even if we think status for a particular person is just this simple function of parent status, we could still have policy play a role in determining the relationship between a person's earnings and that person's status, right? In other words, egalitarian policy could make this D smaller so that high status people and low status people end up getting similar amounts of earnings, right? End up having similar opportunities to earn a lot or earn a little in a particular generation. The relationship between education and status, right, could be influenced by policy. So we could see that aristocracies or upper class groups or high prestige subcultures are incredibly persistent, even in societies like Sweden and Norway, but also see that people who don't come from those high status groups have a similar opportunity to earn a lot of money, have a similar opportunity to achieve a high level of education, have a similar opportunity to go to elite institutions like Oxford and Cambridge, than do those with low status. They might not be able to, if we believe this model, it would suggest that they're not going to be able to transmit those gains to their own children. In other words, they're not going to be able to transmit their mobility to the next generation, but they're still going to be able to experience that mobility themselves. So I think where this leaves us is thinking about, when we think about intergenerational mobility, when we think about ideas like equality of opportunity, how much do we care about, over the very, very long run, the degree to which advantages are persistent, and how much do we care about in the immediate run, every child having a reasonable opportunity to have a decent quality of life? Okay, that's been great. Thank you so much for sticking with me through all of this. I can't wait to talk about this paper with you all on Thursday.